Our subject matter today is also an interesting person, Pasquale Paoli, who was Napoleon's hero for quite a while, was he not?
Yeah, Napoleon actually wrote him fan letters as a young man. That's what a big fan he was.
Mm. And he was also, a general. He led forces in the fight for Corsican independence, Napoleon's home island. And he just had an interesting career. So I thought that's why we talk about him today.
Yeah, let's dive into it.
All right. So Mr. Paoli was born in Corsica in April 1725, and he was the son of a physician who was also a leader in the push for Corsican independence. So it seems to me the island of Corsica has had like many rulers and masters and conquering armies over the years, but it's an interesting place, correct?
Yeah, it's rarely been self-governing
Mhm.
throughout its history. It's almost always been dominated by others, as you pointed out, but it's always sort of remained separate from whatever empire or alliance or coalition was in charge of it. The Corsicans have always been the Corsicans. The
Mhm.
conquerors come and go, the island stays the same.
Right. Right. And around this time, at least the portion of the story that we're going to focus on, the early part, it was, I believe, run by the Republic of Genoa in Italy, correct?
Right. And, Corsica being close to Italy has historically had lots of links to various Italian states. But at this period, Genoa was top dog and, at least in theory, in charge of the island.
Right.
The Genoese really treated Corsica more like it was a colony than a part of their country. It was a source of revenue and a place that had to be, kind of kept under the heel, so to speak.
Right. So,
So it was not a very benevolent regime that the Corsicans were rebelling against.
right. So they always had like some sort of garrison of troops there to kind of keep an eye on the Corsicans, I would imagine.
Right, and make sure they paid their taxes, which the Corsicans were not fond of doing.
Yeah. Yeah. So interestingly enough, though, because Paoli's father was somewhat well off, he was educated in Italy, correct? In Naples?
Right. This is, I think, kind of important and sort of underrated part of Paoli's stories. He, his father was a leader in the Corsican independence movement, and the Corsican independence movement was extremely fractious, lots of infighting,
Mm-hmm.
even like literal combat between different factions among the Corsican rebels.
Mm-hmm.
And his father came out on the losing side of one of these struggles. And so the family went to exile in Naples.
Mm-hmm.
And in Naples, Paoli got well, maybe not a first-rate education, but a very good education in a relatively modern university,
Mm-hmm.
and got some military experience in a traditional military. He's often portrayed as this kind of rustic bandit chieftain, which he sort of was, but he also had this other side to him that had been to university, lived in a big modern city, had been a trained officer in a real military.
Yeah, but like an enlightened thinker, kind of like Napoleon, like a Renaissance man, but who happens to be in the army.
Yeah, but who also has these roots in a very traditional, out of the way kind of place.
Mm-hmm. So he kind of knocks around Italy for a while and then returns to his home island of Corsica. And then he kind of gets involved in politics as well, right?
Yeah, and this was probably Corsica is a very I mean, everywhere in the world at this time, family ties are much more important than they are in our world today.
Right.
But Corsica, in particular, is a place where family ties are very important,
Mm-hmm.
and it has a clan system, so political loyalties are inherited. So it was probably almost inevitable that his father, being a prominent political leader in the independence struggle, that would then be passed down to Paoli, and he became sort of stepped into his father's shoes and returned to Corsica and tried to rally his father's former loyalists.
Yeah, and he works his way up, and sure enough, in 1755, Corsica declares its independence, way before the United States did, and made Paoli its first president, which I think is a pretty amazing rise to power.
Right. I mean, he's in his 30th year at that point.
Yeah.
That's for this era, political leaders did tend to skew a bit younger than they do today.
Yeah.
But 30 is quite young,
Yeah, well,
particularly given that, his young adulthood was not spent in Corsica. He was still in Naples.
yeah, very Napoleon-esque, if you will.
Right.
Yeah. So from there, though, obviously Genoa, they're not having this. They're going to squash this rebellion. And it seems like there's ebbs and tides, ebbs and waves of like either they were able to govern themselves briefly until like another Genoese garrison would show up and put everything down. Is that kind of how it went for a while?
Yeah, Genoa at this period was sort of, historically they had not been a big military power in the sense of raising forces from their own population. Historically, they generally used mercenaries to do most of their fighting.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of this struggle with Genoa is dictated by the budget of the Genoese state. If they have
Mm-hmm.
money for mercenaries and kind of a will to try to enforce their rule on Corsica, they hire a bunch of mercenaries and send them out, and
Right.
the war heats up.
Right.
And then inevitably, the Corsicans hang on in their kind of highland strongholds. The mercenaries, get sick, and some of them go home, and
Mm-hmm.
some of them get killed. And
Right.
over time, they become a less potent force, and the war kind of settles down. And the Genoese sort of retreat. The Genoese had these strongholds on the coast
Mm-hmm.
that could be supplied by the sea, and so the Corsicans couldn't really besiege them,
Right.
because they had no navy.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the Genoese war effort was at a low ebb, they would just sort of pull out of the whole country, except for these little strongholds.
Mm-hmm.
And then Paoli and his government would sort of run the island. And then years pass, and then the Genoese come back and try to do it all over again.
Yeah, and this goes kind of on for about 13 years until 1768, and Genoa is seeking to rid itself of this troublesome island. So what do they do with it?
Well, the French state at this time had been trying to expand in this part of the world, and were looking for opportunities to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And Genoa, Genoa's legal claim on Corsica was not worth very much to them in
Right.
the state of things, because they didn't control most of the island, and it was this was supposed to be a source of cash for the Genoese state, and in fact, it was turning into a boondoggle, because they were hiring all these mercenaries to try to keep it under control.
Right.
And so they wanted to get it off the books.
Mm-hmm.
And why not sell it to the French, who
Right.
were eager to expand in this part of the world?
Yeah, and I think the French were probably, like you said, thrilled to expand their colonialization, and they immediately took over the island and defeated Paoli and his guerrilla fighters, I think, pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's honestly quite depressing to read about that campaign, because Paoli had been this very skilled warrior, and he'd held the Genoese at bay for so long, and had so many kind of well practiced techniques to maintain at least the sort of highland core of Corsica as a free zone.
Mm-hmm.
But those strategies were all geared towards these small Genoese mercenary armies. So when the French come in with a real top flight professional military, lots and lots of troops, there is just nothing the Corsicans can do.
Yeah, I was reading about that as well. His resistance army is made up of militia leaders, like you said, who had competing agendas, and mercenaries with dubious loyalty. Prussians and Hessians who are, they'd fight unless the battle wasn't going their way. Then they would just, flee into the woods.
Right, and that's exactly what happened in some of these battles.
Yep, and then I guess in 1769, the year of Napoleon's birth, Paoli was defeated at the Battle of Ponte Novo, and he fled to England in exile. And I think that's interesting that that's where he fled for exile, to England.
Yeah, and boy, that turned out to be a very fateful choice for him.
Right.
He could have gone back to Italy, where his father had gone when the same thing happened to him.
Mm-hmm. And I guess in England, he was something of a celebrity. I mean, he was, from what I understood, he was showing his bullet-ridden coat to, his fans and crowds out there. And I guess he was somewhat of a celebrity at this time, right?
Oh, I think somewhat is not necessary there. He was a very famous figure in England. A lot of things about Paoli appealed to sort of the enlightened opinion in England at that time. This was the era of this is the height of the Enlightenment, and London is one of the centers of Enlightenment thought. And there's so much about him. Paoli loves making allusions to ancient Rome, and comparing himself and his government to the great heroic republican governments of ancient Rome.
Want to make a podcast? Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easily, then distribute it everywhere, and even earn money, all in one place for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer. So no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. And best of all, it's totally free with no catch. Ever since I discovered Spotify for Podcasters, I've really enjoyed the ease of use and the distribution ability of this platform.
The old Corsica was still represented in his government, but there were also a lot of progressive elements to it, which he, of course, emphasized when he was in England. So he really was seen as this kind of a rustic liberal hero.
Yeah, and I was reading about that too, like the old style of vendetta fighting where there was a high murder rate. He was trying to get rid of that. Like he was trying to have a more enlightened view of how to rule the island.
Right, but he did not, it's funny, there were some elements of sort of old traditional Corsica that he was trying to get rid of, like the vendetta. But, he actually reinforced the clan system. So there were other elements where he was quite a conservative and traditional leader, not unlike Napoleon in some ways, who also, was sort of presented himself and was seen as an Enlightenment figure and someone on the left, but also had all these sort of more conservative impulses and was perfectly happy to compromise with conservatism when he thought was in his interest.
Right. And I guess around this time, the Bonaparte family, I don't know if Napoleon's dad knew Paoli, but they come to start associating themselves with him and idolizing the way he fought against the French. And that old quote about how the French vomited themselves upon the shores of Corsica, and how this brilliant man Paoli was fighting to repel them. I think he saw a lot of himself in Paoli, correct?
Correct. And he also, there is a family connection here. Carlo Bonaparte, or Carlo de Bonaparte, as he was known at that time, was Napoleon's father. And in the very end of Paoli's rule in Corsica, he was actually Paoli's personal secretary, which, that might not sound like much, but, to put it in perspective, George Washington's personal secretary was Alexander Hamilton.
Right.
So, this is a position at this time where that's someone who is being groomed for future political power, because they get to meet all of the political contacts of their boss. We don't know exactly what Paoli would have done with Carlo if, he hadn't been overthrown. But, certainly Carlo had reason to be loyal to Paoli. And the Bonapartes did, fight on his side until the bitter end. Right. According to some stories, even Napoleon's mother was involved in the resistance to the French invasion. So this was, Napoleon as a young man, I think, would sort of romanticize and overemphasize his family's contribution to the Paoli movement,
right?
Because he idolized him so much. But there was this family connection that he was basing that on. That wasn't totally fantasy.
Right. No, that's very interesting. And I want to talk about, before we get to the French Revolution, before Paoli went back to Corsica, there was some talk or some alluding to the British giving him a pension if he would push their interests if he ever returned to Corsica. Do you think that was legitimate? Did that really happen, or was that more of a handshake deal?
I've never seen hard evidence of that, so I wouldn't know exactly what what the nature of that agreement, or if it existed, was.
Mhm.
But it is worth saying, whether or not they actually put pen to ink or signed some kind of contract, or if there was some kind of, like you said, a handshake deal,
Right.
they wouldn't have needed one.
Right.
But after a couple of years in England,
Yeah.
Paoli became extremely. I mean, he loved England.
Right.
He loved the English. He
Mhm.
admired their system of government. He admired their intellectual life.
Mhm.
He was an Anglophile, and
Mhm.
he really he was there for a long time, and it became a home to him. And why not? These people idolized him. Of course, he liked it there.
Right. Well, I guess, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right?
Of
So,
course, there's that element too. If he ever hoped to regain power, Britain would be the likeliest way for that to happen.
indeed. So moving along in the story, the French Revolution begins in earnest, 1789, 1790. He returns to Corsica, and there's a young Napoleon now who's gone through the military schools and he's in the army. What kind of happens there? How do they come in contact again?
There are many great stories about how Napoleon and Paoli finally met. Napoleon had written him fan letters. Paoli had never responded to any of them. Obviously, busy man, very famous. He got a lot of fan letters. But you also have to wonder if there were some hard feelings about Carlo Bonaparte, because Carlo Bonaparte had been invited to go into exile with Paoli. And many of those close to Paoli had gone to London with him. Carlo was one of the few who did not.
Okay.
And it seems that Paoli considered this a betrayal. Maybe not treason or anything that grand, but that that this hurt him, and that it lowered his opinion of Carlo.
Yeah.
So maybe looking at that signature Bonaparte, seeing that he was a soldier in the French army, the army that Paoli had fought against, who had taken his government away from him.
Yeah.
He probably was not disposed to like Napoleon.
Yeah. In fairness, though, Paoli never had any kids and was never married. And Carlo was raising, at this point, how many kids? So maybe he's like, I can't do that right now. I'm raising 7 kids in Corsica. I can't just exile.
Right. Yeah. To uncertain prospects in a foreign country, we didn't speak the language.
Correct. So,
but when Paoli finally meets Napoleon, according to one story, Napoleon and his brothers, Lucien and Joseph, they were kind of a team at this point. And apparently the Bonaparte brothers, soon after meeting him, sort of told him how wrong he'd been, and how he could have done a better job resisting the French, if we'd only done this and this.
That's not a good opener when you meet your hero.
No, and they had not been born yet when these events occurred.
Right.
So the idea that they're going to come in and play Monday morning quarterback to this extremely respected aging general did not go over well. And of course, there were also the political, the Bonaparte brothers were at this time, you almost considered them on the radical left. I mean, they were on the sort of furthest left of the, mainstream political spectrum, whereas Paoli, had been seen as this big liberal hero for most of his life, but, he'd been living in England and getting older, and had sort of, had never really been as far to the left as his reputation had suggested, and then with time had moved to the right. And so by the time he arrives in Corsica, he has a very different political outlook from the Bonapartes.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I read that, Napoleon asked for Paoli's opinion on his writings, and he found them to be amateurish and too impassioned, which probably makes sense. If you're a centrist and some crazy leftist or rightist is asking you for your opinion on his writing, you're going to be like, it's too much.
Although it's worth mentioning about that anecdote, when Napoleon originally sent Paoli his manuscript, Paoli didn't respond to it. He only responded months later, after he had gotten in a political spat with the Bonapartes. So I think that was actually just pure pettiness. That, this is, and that really, that shows you sort of the less savory side of Paoli's character. By this point, he's in his 60s.
Right.
And these are sort of enthusiastic young men in their early 20s.
Yeah.
And you would think that, as annoying as they probably were, he would, as a, statesman in his 60s, take a sort of more gentle approach.
As if the McCrispy couldn't get any better, Bacon and Ranch just entered the chat. The Bacon Ranch McCrispy, available at participating McDonald's for a limited time. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Now, this next part is interesting to me. In 1793, Paoli sought to conquer the neighboring island of Sardinia. Now, was this a legitimate plan that he wanted to do this, or was he just trying to get rid of Napoleon in this fool's errand?
This whole story is very weird.
Yeah.
This is not a very well-known part of Napoleon's biography, and I think people gloss over it just because it's early and it's kind of strange, and it's hard to really judge, what was going on there. I think what happened is, so this was ordered by the government in Paris.
Correct.
This strike on Sardinia.
Yep. And
I think that in part they were sort of unsure if they could trust Paoli, and so they asked him to do something, to risk some of his resources, the Corsican National Guard, to further the revolution.
Right.
Basically as a loyalty test to see if he would do it.
Because you're supposed to be ruling Corsica in our stead, or at least in our interest, correct?
Right. Yeah. He's kind of the regional governor at this point.
Got it.
And so they're just, he's kind of an unknown quantity because he's been in London for so long.
Right.
And is he purely self-interested? Does he think his self-interest aligns with us? Is he just sitting on the fence? Well, one way to find out is order him to do something and see if he complies.
Right. And
he did, but the government in Paris told him to send 10,000. He sent 6,000.
Right.
All of the guardsmen he sent came from regions where he was not as popular and were led by people, including Napoleon, who were affiliated with the revolutionary government, who, he would have probably seen as his political enemies.
Mm-hmm.
He puts one of his cousins in charge, overall command.
Nepotism. Yeah.
Right. Classic.
Yeah.
But the junior people under his cousin are all sort of anti-Paoli people, or at least people he would have perceived as being anti-Paoli.
Yeah.
So probably he's hoping some of these guys die, probably including Napoleon.
Right. And I think that's the other point to point out, that Napoleon is not the all-knowing, all-wise Napoleon yet. He's still a young man at this point.
Yeah, although he himself performed pretty well in this expedition, in the limited role he had. But the overall commander was extremely cautious, and sort of the strategy is sort of unclear what he was even trying to do. The island that they were attacking had been reinforced heavily right before the attack. So it sort of seems like maybe someone was tipped off, maybe by Paoli.
Yeah, and the invasion was a disaster. And like I said, it seemed like the Sardinians were waiting for them, and Napoleon was defeated along with the rest of the strike force.
Yeah, now, I mean, he and his men ended up having to abandon their guns.
Yeah.
Which is not something Napoleon likes to do.
No, or any army. You hate to abandon the cannons for sure. Now, obviously this enrages Napoleon, and he goes back to Corsica, and then the story really gets interesting from there.
Right. Napoleon and some of his fellow officers, worth pointing out, writes a letter to the revolutionary government, basically laying out what we've just been talking about, that something seemed very wrong about this whole operation.
Right.
And laying out, if something was wrong with it, the motives and the person behind this are pretty obvious. So this is an explosive letter, but it is secret. This is a classified military report.
Right.
So there's still not a public schism between the Bonapartes and Paoli. But then Lucien Bonaparte, who's very young, still a teenager at this point, gives a speech at a Jacobin club in southern France.
Right.
And that speech is basically a denunciation of Paoli, which up until now, the Bonapartes have been afraid to do.
Right.
And he really laid into him, called him a traitor and a liar. And no one knows exactly how this happened, but it turned out to be a very important moment in history. Someone wrote that speech down and published it.
Wow.
With Lucien's name on it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that went all over southern France.
Wow.
All the Jacobin clubs were reading these speeches, and
Yeah.
that one was one of them once it spread. So, of course, Paoli found out about it very quickly,
Right.
and was not pleased.
I can imagine. I mean, you're a 65-year-old man or 60-year-old man, and some 18-year-old at a club in France is saying these outlandish things about you.
Well, and he'd already had his conflicts with the Bonapartes, and he was sort of at the end of his rope with them anyway.
Right.
So to be the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, this is like a massive, like 40-ton straw, like just completely obliterating any hope of ever having a relationship, a positive relationship with Paoli.
So the reaction is basically the Bonaparte family has to flee with basically the clothes on their back, correct?
Right. And this is, to me, one of the key moments of Napoleon's life. I mean, he has, not only beyond failed, everything is lost. The government has seized the family's lands and properties. He is an outlaw.
Right.
And Napoleon has to make his way through the rugged interior of Corsica on foot to get to where he knows his brother is in a friendly town where they can get a ship to France.
Yeah.
And he was very fortunate that he ran across some friendly shepherds. The first people he encounters on this, this harrowing trip are people he knows who are friends of his family. And they agree to help him, and they take him north with them. And, decades and decades later, when Napoleon died, all those men who had helped him on that trip when he was a young man were mentioned in his will and given huge benefits. Yeah.
Wow. I did not know that. But yeah, you wonder, like, the history of Europe would have been a lot different if Paoli and his supporters had caught up to Napoleon and his family.
Or, frankly, if anyone except those guys had caught up to him. I mean, really, the whole island was after him, and he was incredibly fortunate that rather than running into anyone else, he ran into people who were inclined to help him.
Right. Well, you think now with this pesky Bonaparte family out of the way, Paoli's good to go in Corsica, but I guess that is not the way it went, correct?
Right. This is this persecution of the Bonaparte family coincided with a general purge of sort of pro-revolutionary, pro-French people in Corsica. Paoli really, this is like I think the political science term is an auto coup. He's sort of illegally cementing his power as dictator and rounding up his political opponents.
Right.
And invites in the British, as he perhaps promised to years ago.
Right.
But many people on Corsica did not accept this. And there was a resistance movement against him, led by a former count named Casabianca, who turned out to be a good military leader. And there turned out to be a lot of opposition to Paoli in Corsica. So there's a very bloody and bitter war as Paoli and the British cement their control over the island, which obviously did not engender good feelings with a lot of the population.
Right. And so in 1795, he has to flee again. He has to go back to England, I guess, because things weren't going his way.
No, I mean, he, his first tenure as dictator of Corsica, he'd shown so much promise. He'd been so effective, not only at promoting his own interests, but, in building bridges and keeping this very fractious Corsican political system, under harmonious and under his control and developing the country. But his second tenure is much rockier. He doesn't seem as sharp. He's much less popular, and he seems not to care. That pettiness we saw with him, trashing Napoleon's writing, seems to have become a permanent character trait at this point. He's very vindictive and bitter. The British don't enjoy working with him and wind up kind of undermining him and trying to promote sort of alternative pro-British Corsican leaders, but that doesn't really work out very well. So it's kind of a sad story. As you said, in 95, he's back on a ship to England.
So what becomes of this grumpy old man? He's lost his dictatorship now twice, and he's heading back to the British Isles.
Yeah, and this is kind of the tragedy side of the arc. people in England are not as hot on him anymore. With the war raging, there's new heroes and new villains and exciting new things happening in the world. And people are focused on that rather than on something that happened, decades ago.
Right.
And of course, there are people who are aware that he has not been so helpful to British interests and hold him in contempt because of that.
Right.
But he does still have his admirers, and so he lives, a relatively comfortable life. But as far as we can tell, he's not doing much during these years.
Right. And then he passes in 1807. So before really the Napoleonic epic ends, he's kind of like right in the middle of the empire passes. It's an interesting legacy. And I have two questions kind of to wrap up on. One, what is his legacy? And two, do you think there would have been a Napoleon without this man kind of inspiring him or at least lighting a lantern to lead the way for his career, Napoleon's career?
Well, in the first question, his legacy, I'm always fascinated. I think if you could go back and talk to people in, say the 1770s, and say, and you told them that Paoli was not a name that even educated people know, that he's, kind of an obscure figure who's only really known to students of, really, if it wasn't for Napoleon, most people would not know who he is.
Right.
That would shock people in the 1770s. He was a global celebrity, one of the first, you could argue. And so I think that's an interesting part of his legacy, to go from someone who's almost universally admired and almost universally beloved to someone who's not even really remembered, is a fascinating change. But it's worth mentioning, he is still very much remembered in Corsica. And sort of what you think about Paoli in Corsica has a lot of resonance on modern politics.
Yeah.
Because there is a Corsican nationalist movement today, some of whom want sort of more autonomy and cultural recognition and linguistic recognition, and then a more radical side that want independence from France. And this was in the 70s and 80s. This was a very big and vital question in Corsican politics. There were even terrorist groups that fought.
Right.
And Paoli's legacy is very important to the Corsican nationalist movement. A lot of these organizations are named after him or have his picture as their symbol. He is really still among that it should be said, relatively small segment of Corsican society. He is still an icon, and has continued to be. They've never forgotten him.
Yeah, and I was reading, the American Sons of Liberty movement was inspired by him.
Yes, there was a lot of, in the American Revolution, there was a lot of love for Paoli, which is why there's so many places in America named after him.
Yeah, and going back to your point when you started, like in the 1770s, 1780s, in 1776, the editor of the New York Journal described Paoli as, quote, the greatest man on earth, end quote. Which, that's amazing that he was that legendary and famous, like you stated earlier.
I remember I read a historian once who compared him to Che Guevara in the 60s.
Yeah.
And just, how anyone in the world who saw themselves as a progressive, on the left, whatever you want to call it, maybe they didn't agree with everything he did, but they all looked up to him and saw him as an icon and, a symbol of sort of, positive change in the world.
Right. And well-educated like Che. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And also with, Paoli's father was a physician. Che was a physician.
That's right. Now, on my second question, that one's a bit trickier. What do you think would have been a Napoleon without this man's influence?
That's impossible to say, obviously.
Yeah.
I will say this. I think Paoli looms extremely large in Napoleon's life. Maybe if you're looking at influences on him as a child, maybe only his parents loom larger.
Right.
Napoleon was practically obsessed with this story for most of his childhood and young adulthood. And I think he picked up a lot of things, maybe not even consciously. For instance, his house, where he grew up, was sort of a de facto clubhouse for veterans of Paoli's forces.
Mm-hmm.
So he was around, not only his father and mother who had known these people and part of these events, but a lot of adults he was around as a young man had been important players in these events.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that instilled in him the sense that, yeah, anyone can play a role in history. It doesn't matter if you're from this out of the way island. Look, the greatest icon, the greatest liberal icon of this era was born only a few miles away. Why not me too?
Yeah.
And that's something you see even very young. Napoleon almost assumed that he would become a great man of history.
Yeah.
And I think that without that influence of Paoli, that idea would not have been so strong, or maybe not as well formed. And I also think, because when Napoleon was a young man, Paoli's sort of credentials as a man of the Enlightenment, a man of reason, a man of progress, a liberal, were impeccable. As we discussed, that reputation is maybe not totally deserved, because he also had this sort of conservative side, and
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of his image as a liberal icon was marketing by him.
Right.
But I think that did create in Napoleon's mind the idea, maybe not create, but contribute to the idea in Napoleon's mind that being a reformer, a progressive, whatever you want to call it, a force for change in the world, is not necessarily in opposition to being a dictator, a sort of ruthless military leader, a person who dominates the political scene rather than sort of collaborating with other political actors. Paoli was a dictator in every
Mm-hmm.
sense of the word, and he could be tyrannical.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think Napoleon, he was an icon. He didn't see this as a contradiction. He saw that you could be a force for change in the world and a good liberal while also being a tyrant.
Right. Yeah, you can have different facets to your personality and your leadership style, I guess, is where what I kind of take away from that.
Yeah, and I think today we see we see sort of democracy, egalitarianism as sort of synonymous with progress.
Mm-hmm.
And that was not true at this time. And I think, in fact, for Napoleon, Paoli would have been the natural model, and Paoli didn't believe that at all.
Right.
So, when people look at Napoleon as this kind of contradictory figure, well, that's really more from our modern perspective.
Right.
In Napoleon's mind, his icons of progress and liberalism are not democratic, are not egalitarian.
Mm-hmm.
It's this guy who was a guerrilla chieftain.
Yeah. And like his heroes from old, Alexander the Great or Julius
Mm-hmm.
Those were not necessarily the most liberal of men.
No, in a certain sense they were progressive, you could argue, because they gave important new institutions and improved their people's standard of living and all that.
Right.
But there's definitely not a sort of democratic subtext to any of that. That was all just shamelessly imposed from the top.
Correct.
And Napoleon, saw that as a perfectly natural model, and I think in large part because of Paoli.
Yeah. Agreed. Well, that was mind blowing. I learned so much right in that chat right there that I didn't know. This is really an interesting man, and I think he does deserve more examination. Like you said, 200 years ago, he was the most famous man on earth. So yeah, I think he deserves more attention than he gets, and I'm glad you educated all of us on that. I think it was really interesting.
Thank you. I personally, it probably came through on the show. I personally am very fascinated by Paoli.
Yeah.
And when I first started doing my show, I was kind of trying to decide how to cover Napoleon's childhood. And I thought, you know what? This is such a huge influence on Napoleon. And I find him so fascinating that I'm really going to just go for it and do a lot of content on Paoli. Whatever the listeners can make of that what they will. But I was surprised to find that actually he's kind of a fan favorite of my listeners.
Really?
People loved hearing about this guy. And I get questions still about him all the time.
Interesting.
So I think that this is a person who I'm hoping that means he's going to, start to be getting his due in the future.
Right, for sure. Well, Everett, thank you for being on the show. This was really great. I appreciate all that information, and well done, sir.
Well, thank you very much. I had a great time.